And today, during our presentations, we also want to exemplify being nimble and agile. So George is going to go next while we then get Catherine queued up for the third. So George.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about, I guess, my basic experience in digital learning started in the late 90s. I was at Red River College in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and we were the first college in Canada that went exclusively laptop. And the impact of that technology was fascinating. And on the one hand, the faculty members took their transparencies that they'd used before and put them into PowerPoint slides. And the method of instruction had very little change. The students, on the other hand, had a complete change. They started, at that point it was ICQ, they started messaging back and forth with one another. We were doing online testing, which meant that they were answering questions for each other through ICQ, and which wasn't exactly what we wanted, but we discovered very quickly that technology has an uneven impact on the population based on their expertise and their intent with the technology. And that's been my driving research question since then, is how do technologies influence how we create networks, develop, and share knowledge? I want to talk specifically about some of the aspects of online learning. And at least a bit of the challenges, Ruud, and this was mentioned early on, Pamela addressed this about the changing economy and some of those dimensions. But here's just a quick illustration or visualization of how quick this particular activity has transitioned. So on the one hand, do I need to click my 12-minute start button, or I'm going to be confused and talk for an hour? But on the one hand, this was the impact in the manufacturing as the largest employer in these states in 1990s. Now, fast forward a quarter decade, and this has been the economic change as the primary employer by sector within these different states. So you can see what was manufacturing in a very short time frame became healthcare. This is a critical aspect to think about because somewhere an awful lot of people had to be re-educated. A huge population had to be reskilled in areas that they weren't expert in before, and an entire flow of funds from venture capital to organization of society to related tax schemes had to be reoriented. So there's an economic imperative around the drive to digital learning, and that imperative is around reskilling and giving individuals the capability to participate in this economy. But we're also seeing a fundamental change in our student population. One example I've commonly cited is, we're now moving from what has been a 4-year relationship with our students as higher education institutions to what's now a 40-year relationship. Our students come back to us for reskilling and upskilling. They return to the higher education sector in droves in ways that we just haven't seen in the past and that our traditional continuing education divisions aren't able to accommodate. So essentially, the idea of a university is complexifying. Our student population is different and the economic imperative is different from what it's been in the past. And this expansion reflects a growing need for all sectors. It doesn't matter where you're involved in, but for all sectors to pursue advanced education. Many individuals don't want to reskill by quitting their job, going to work, and then or going to university and then coming back. This is something that certain fields like nursing, for example, have been top of for decades, but a lot of other sectors haven't realized this need for skilling and reskilling in flexible ways. So this is where we get into the space of digital learning and the impact of digital learning. Now, there's a number of aspects that go beyond just digital learning as a core concept, because as I mentioned, we are at risk of doing what our faculty did at Red River College, which is take digital learning and keep the practices, but just use a new media to do it, rather than using the affordances of this particular medium. And so we've seen a lot of interest in things like self-regulated learning, self-directed learning, learners choosing the goals and the interests that they might have, huge interest in social media, MOOCs, community development online. So one of the things that stands very poorly over a long period of time in a digital age is traditional hierarchical structure. Networks cut horizontally, initially in terms of the structure that we're accustomed to, but they eventually move vertically. Initially horizontal, but they eventually move horizontally across our organizations, because the structures that we created to manage our curriculum, to do our instructional work, just don't survive well in a digital network space. So traditionally, we've had something that looks like this. This is vastly simplified, but it's teacher, content, and student. And we have this relationship where we use content as the mediating agent between our interactions. For anyone that's teaching these days, you know your students come in having watched a TED Talk on the topic. They're going to take a MOOC on the stats course that you taught. They're going to come in sometimes with error in their views and opinions, because not everything on TED Talk is applicable in a college classroom. But the mindset that we're seeing is students come in with a very different framework and world perspective, and they're feeding themselves intellectually in a way that we used to think we were quite critical and important, but we've become, as faculty, a node among an overall knowledge network. And that changes how we error correct, it changes how we develop our students. It also changes the actions that are available to students. One of the NSF grants we're working on right now with Carnegie Mellon is this idea of multiple pathway selections. Why do students go in one direction versus another direction? What are the attributes of the students and the design of a learning space that causes one student to follow the sequential structured course and another student to say, you know what, I'm going to just learn on my own, and I'm going to take a mess of MOOCs, and I'm going to read on my own, and I'm going to hang out on Google Scholar, and I'll meet my own knowledge needs. We looked at this in a report about 2 years ago called Preparing for the Digital University. If anyone's interested, it's a free download. It's on our University of Texas Arlington Link research site. But we just looked at what are the factors based on literature that are worth considering in the development of digital learning materials and resources. Everything from program support to the profile of the student to learning design activities to utilization and selection of technology and so on. So I just want to reference that even though I'm talking about these things sort of in bits and pieces, it's very important to see this as a holistic entity. It's a holistic system of performance and interaction. You're going to get suboptimal results with your learning and development if you focus on, hey, let's offer an online course. But don't develop faculty, don't work with learning designers, don't build the capabilities of your students, don't build in support structures for students who encounter challenges in their learning process. So I just want to emphasize this is a holistic framework and perspective. Now, the digital learning space has changed very quickly. One of the aspects that we have seen in terms of the percentage of students that are taking digital learning approaches, whether it's blended or fully online, eventually in the long run, everything will be digital learning. I mean, that's just where we're coalescing. And there was a report that was done by Barbara Means with the U.S. Department of Education a few years ago. Eventually became a book, Teaching Online, but that focused on exactly this topic, which is, what works better, online, blended, or in classroom learning? And the answer, perhaps not surprisingly, is the blended approach, because it sort of brings the best of both of those perspectives. So growing percentage of individuals taking online learning, and faculty attitudes are changing quickly as well, in terms of we're approaching 50% of faculty in traditional university campuses that are teaching online and certainly are teaching with technology. So we can see a continual annual technology creep. And I remember in early 2000, EDUCAUSE would put together these campus technology use reports, and we're dealing with low participation levels both of students and faculty, and that's completely changed. There was a McGraw-Hill report that surveyed 1,000 students. It came out about 2 weeks ago, and they found on every front students' use of technology, even including 35% of the student population use their mobile devices for accessing learning materials. It's just a continual encroachment of digitization in the learning process. Now, this is also reflective of, as a greater number of professors start to teach online, there's also a change in their perspectives and their attitudes. So we're crossing that threshold point where faculty are now saying, yeah, actually we can do significant high quality instruction in online environments. And that's just a function of the experience. You teach in the environment, you get comfortable with the environment, and then you end up being able to, in turn, recognize the value that that has for reaching student populations. Now, this isn't just a U.S.-centric perspective. If you look even just at Europe, Europe doesn't face the same cost pressures generally that U.S. higher education does, which means we don't, whereas we think extensively about what's the ROI on this particular initiative, in Europe it's more what's the public service of this particular initiative, which is a very different conversation. And that was reflected in some of the interest on why MOOCs are being offered by European universities. And the interest there is, well, they're really being offered just for anyone, whoever cares. It's not just that it's targeting a specific student population, but it's available for anyone that's interested. And more consequentially, why are European institutions running MOOCs? A tiny fraction are running MOOCs in order to generate income. Vast majority are about flexible learning opportunities, campus visibilities, improving and increasing impact. Now, some of you are thinking, but George, I just read an article that said MOOCs are dead. Why are you giving us MOOC data? Well, it's worth emphasizing that in the hottest field right now, 59% of the population in data science learned their data science skills through MOOCs or through self-directed online learning. This is a field with a median entry salary of $110,000. These skill sets were acquired through these kinds of environments. And I've said this, for a number of years, but MOOCs were essentially a supply-side answer to a decades-long demand-side increase in learning needs. Universities kind of ignored it, but it's becoming more apparent that this, the flexibility of learning and learning opportunities are critical in this landscape. So we then enter this stage. Something I think about a lot, and sort of my primary research question these days, is the idea of what does it mean to be human in a digital age, and what do we need to teach versus what should technology do for us? Question I sometimes wonder, you've probably seen the stats that an AI system can more accurately and consistently diagnose the presence of cancerous tissue in a mammogram than a human being can. So my question then is, why would universities be teaching that to a human being if the technology is already outperforming them at a significant level? Should we be teaching different things in different ways in the university campus and the university experience? So it's difficult, and this is a question that we all face as a society, and this isn't like a face in 20 years. This is a face in the next 5 years. What does the technology teach and develop versus what do we in turn teach and develop within our own campus environments and the course structures that we create? It's inefficient to do with humans what can be done with technology, and yet it's also not productive to do with technology what needs to be done with human beings. That's a longer argument, but essentially I'll say that what technology is actually doing is pushing us more toward our humanity. So I'll say we're entering this idea of a being age, where the mindsets, the attributes, and the World Economic Forum has reports on this as well that articulates being able to work with others, being able to think in complex systems is actually the key output in this kind of an environment. And so it should be centered to any development of new curriculum or new content is what does the technology do versus what do the human beings do. And so this idea then that we move to something that better accentuates our human attributes versus the technology structures that we have available. And these are things like combinatorial creativity, where we focus on collaboratively developing knowledge, where we emphasize that we're not interested in you memorizing facts, but in you understanding the implications of connections and what happens when a new connection is added to a knowledge space, or what happens when a connection is deleted or eliminated. This is a part of a project we're doing with Smart Sparrow and Arizona State University, funded by Bill and Melinda Gates, where we're looking at the idea that we change our methods of science instruction to fact and related approaches to one that emphasizes learning as a system of exploration, where we try and target the ability for individuals to understand relationships, but also to ask provocative questions, questions that relate to, are we alone? Could we survive, let's say, with the Ebola crisis or other situations that arise, which requires us to start looking at what we've siloed and ask questions, because you can't ask a question like, are we alone, by looking at one domain of knowledge. Even though we have structured these domains vertically, networks will force them to be horizontal. And so the focus then is, if you're going to ask a question of, are we alone, you need to look at biology and chemistry and physics and general ed and a number of topic areas in order to be able to answer those kinds of questions. So it's not just a change in what we're teaching, it's going to be a fundamental change in how we're teaching and how we teach that in relation to artificial intelligence systems. So a number of questions relate around online learning. Final slide here, but it's about the systemic integration. It's about how do we provide scaffolded support for students, and there's a number of things that are still lacking in the knowledge space to be able to answer these questions, which is specifically, we don't know our students and we haven't intelligently mapped our curriculum so that we can actually begin to move toward adaptive and personalized learning in a meaningful way that addresses this exploration view of learning.
Thank you, George. We have a question.
Well, excellent presentation, George. Quick question. Theoretically, it would appear that with increasing online learning, we would be bridging the gap between different groups, so there'll be less inequity. Do you have any preliminary data? I know it's a little early. Do you have any preliminary data suggesting that that is actually what is happening?
Unfortunately, it's actually a little bit the opposite. There was a recent report that was posted, I think it was it was in June of this year. I think it was a Brookings Institute. And they found something that we've all known in the distance education space, which is economic disparity is it's a structural poverty problem, not a medium problem, which means if you are from a lower socioeconomic status or lower income minority, whatever terms you use, adding technology to your learning experience will actually have negative impacts. And the reason for that is due to their scaffolded supports that haven't been built into place into digital learning. So people who look at digital learning say, yay, let's help the poor people. And then the poor people say, well, I might not have a laptop and I have the knowledge, but I don't have the support system. I don't know what APA formatting is. I can't go to my parents or my brother and say, hey, when you were in university, how did you do this? So if you're targeting the lower income minority populations, an entire scaffolded structure that's not related to the content, but to the process of being a learner in higher education needs to be created to support that population.